Okay. People may wander in, but I'd like to get started because there's another event that's coming right after us. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Minnesota Transform Showcase. We're glad you're here. My name is Tracey Deutsch. I'm on the leadership team of Minnesota Transform, and I'm thrilled to welcome you and to moderate this roundtable, which is a kickoff to a week-long series of events. It feels very appropriate to me to begin this week of Minnesota Transform partner projects with this panel on teaching carcerality, because it combines so many of the goals and practices of Minnesota Transform, which is to put humanities into struggles for racial justice. Doing so forces us to cross lines of discipline, school, faculty, staff, and student, and to question business as usual policies. And it's very meaningful to do this in terms of the education that we give to students. I think you'll see all of this on full display today. For access purposes, I am a short white woman with curly dark brown hair, which, if I am being fully honest, has some gray in it today. I will insist on being called middle-aged for the foreseeable future, FYI. I'm wearing a black jacket, a green shirt, and a green and silver scarf. For accessibility purposes, today's event is a hybrid. Before we get started, we want to check in about a few logistics. For folks in person and on Zoom who are participating by listening, is my volume okay? Okay, great, thanks. And everyone in the room can hear, okay, great. For folks in person and on Zoom who are using Sight, can you see me okay? Okay, thanks. There's live professional captioning available via the Zoom captions feature or the stream text link that's added in the chat. In-person participation can also pull up the stream text link on your personal devices. When our presenters begin, we will share any available access copies or materials digitally. There are also print copies in the back of the room for anyone who needs them. We want to encourage you to use this space and our digital space in whatever way best supports your engagement. If that means getting up, sitting down, stimming, doing yoga, taking a break, lying down, do whatever you need to do. Please help yourself to drinks and refreshments if you're here in person. There's coffee and tea in the back, cookies, and gluten and dairy-free options. Minnesota Transform is committed to making our events as inclusive and accessible as possible for all our community members, because health justice and disability justice are a part of racial justice and Indigenous sovereignty. We know that systemic inequity means that marginalized people and populations, especially those who are negatively racialized, are more likely to experience disabling conditions than people in populations with more social privilege and resources. This includes the devastating impacts of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. We have masks available if you need one. Thanks for helping us provide care for our community members. Does anyone have any access needs or support that we should know about before we get started? I'm going to take that as okay. Our next step in welcoming you all is to acknowledge that the University of Minnesota was not only built on unceded Dakota land, but built with the profits from selling thousands of acres of Dakota and Anishinaabe land. Both forms of injustice demand accountability and reparations, including but not limited to expanded accessibility to the U's Native American Promise tuition program, sustained funding for the American Indian Studies Department and Native-led student groups, and a meaningful collaboration with Minnesota's 11 Native nations to self-determine what land back means regarding the 30,000 acres of land that the university currently owns. Angela, can you advance to the next slide? For some reason, it's not moving.
Tracey, this is Angela speaking. Someone on your computer needs to advance the slides.
Yeah, it's not letting me. Oh, there it is. Okay, just last week, a 500-page report called Truth was released detailing our university's role in native dispossession and exploitation. We encourage you to review it and demand the reparations recommendations. You can access and read the full Truth report at the Z link listed here on the slide. We also have hard copies of the executive summary if you're interested. Minnesota Transform is a major higher education initiative engaging anti-colonial and racial justice work through the public humanities at the University of Minnesota, in the Twin Cities, and across the state of Minnesota. Supported by a Just Futures Mellon grant, Minnesota Transform puts humanities on the front lines through numerous public and university partnerships and hundreds of student internships on racial justice. On campus, Minnesota Transform lays the groundwork for structural changes that expand the university's racial justice work. We are part of and we help to support universities reckoning with racism, dispossession, and exclusion in ways that reimagine the university and elaborate its possibilities. We want to thank the Mellon Foundation, whose Just Futures initiative we are proud to be part of, the Institute for Advanced Study, which incubated this project and has been a crucial home for us. Today, we are also welcomed by the Liberal Arts Engagement Hub, whom we thank enormously for letting us take up this space. We also want to thank the many staff, students, colleagues, and community members across and beyond campus who have joined in our projects, made things work, and whose energies have made this event and MNT possible. Today's event is part of a week-long series of events that highlight the projects done by Minnesota Transform partners. Please check out our website at minnesotatransform.com for more information. Directly following this event, we welcome Fernando Berga, who will present his work on the Panorama Project. Dr. Berga has worked with several students to create extraordinary visual records of Lake Street and West Broadway corridors from the immediate aftermath of the murder of George Floyd until today, in order to track and evaluate their transformation. You're very welcome to stay and join us for that event or for any other event. And please help yourself to drinks and snacks that are along the back wall. Now, it is my real pleasure to introduce our panelists for today's event, today's roundtable, Teaching Carcerality. Susanna Blumenthal, on my right, is a legal historian whose scholarship is broadly concerned with the problematics of personhood, focusing more particularly on conceptions of ability and disability and questions of identity, agency, and responsibility. At the University of Minnesota, she holds the William L. Prosser Professorship in Law and is also Professor of History and co-director of the program in Law and History. Dewitt King, on the left, is a PhD candidate in the Department of American Studies at the University of Minnesota. He's an interdisciplinary Black Studies scholar whose work resides at the intersection of critical human geography, cultural studies, and sports studies. Broadly, he is interested in the way that power manifests itself in space and place, the interplay between processes of racialization and technology, and the relationship between cultural production and the political economy. He's currently working on a dissertation that examines the labor precarity in professional wrestling, where he centers the experiences of Black professional wrestlers. Akeem Anderson, on the left, is from Brooklyn, New York, but is currently based out of the Twin Cities. He's of Guyanese and Panamanian descent. He is currently a JD and PhD student at the University of Minnesota in the Law School and American Studies Department, respectively. He was also a student in the abolition course in fall 2021. Akeem is working to redefine and reconceptualize the ways in which the intersections of race, health, and law are utilized and used as a point of strategic reference in issues of DEI and medical health care. Outside of the U, he actively enjoys working on photography, as well as with plants and animals in the house. Treasure Tinsley, on my right, is a PhD candidate in history at the University of Minnesota. She is broadly interested in the histories of gender and sexuality, legal history, critical university studies, and histories of the carceral state. Her research focuses on the reproductive and carceral politics of urban renewal in the Cedar Riverside neighborhood of Minneapolis. a project she came to as a student in abolition in the carceral state in 2021. Treasure was also an RA for the course in summer of 2022 and the TA that following fall. Ellen Holt-Werle, on the far right, is the institutional archivist in university archives. After working for more than 15 years as a small liberal arts college archivist, she started here at the U in September 2021. She has already been able to help facilitate critical questions that people are asking about the history of the university, including the ones asked in this class. She is particularly interested in a more complex and nuanced understanding of university history, especially with regards to BIPOC and other excluded and underrepresented experiences and student activism and protest. Thank you. So I thought that we could start by inviting the students to talk about what they took from this class, both in terms of their own research, their careers as teachers and instructors, and also in terms of how they might combine commitments to social change with academic careers and work, even in terms of how they think about the archives as a site and a methodology. Oh, okay. Susanna would like to start by sharing a little bit about the impetus for the class.
Yeah, I promised I'd sort of set the table
Okay.
about the course first, and then I will be really eager to hear about what each of you took from the course. Just to give you a sense of, and because I really want to articulate the ways in which Minnesota Transform was just absolutely central to the existence of this course in the first instance. As many of us experienced in the summer of 2020, as especially those of us within the academy, there was a sense of urgency, a sense of an opening and an imperative to do something with this moment. And I found myself personally kind of facing all these queries, like from the press or students who wanted to have panels or faculty who wanted to put together different kinds of teach-ins and things like that. And the two things I kept being asked were sort of forward-looking, like what's going to happen in the trial of Derek Chauvin, or how did we get here? And I felt in both of those situations completely overmatched by the task in front of me. I felt like it was beyond my wheelhouse in some really fundamental way, even as I felt this need and urgency. And it was then that I started having conversations with Tracey as they were developing their vision of Minnesota Transform, and it provided the inspiration and the material support every step of the way. This program would not have gotten, this class would not have gotten off the ground without the support and vision of Minnesota Transform. I seriously would not have been able to put this together without those kinds of conversations. And they've been crucial at every stage into the present. We're going into the third year of teaching in the fall of 2023. And I continue to bring up Tracey all the time. So the idea of this course is to try to find a way to make the archives the kind of foundation for calling the university and other institutions, especially the carceral state, to account in a way, using the space of the classroom as a site for thinking critically about the problem of the contemporary carceral state as it exists. And I'm just going to read you the course description so you have a sense of what these students signed up for in being a part of this endeavor. It is as follows. Using the lens of abolitionist thought, this course explores the past, present, and future of the carceral state. It places present day movements to abolish police and prisons in historical perspective and explores the way history has been used by activists in pursuit of racial justice and social equality. The course will include archival research, and students will have the opportunity to engage with scholars, advocates, community organizations as they formulate and carry out their projects. Here, the idea was there's, both abolition and the carceral state have a history, and there are all sorts of ways in which abolition has kind of a historical imagination to it in its present instantiations as a social movement. And there's ways of imagining the carceral state that are also, I think, very much in need of, I think, greater elaboration and study as a historical matter. And the main ambition of this course in my mind was to bring law in relationship to the carceral state. Too often the carceral state is understood to comprehend law and the state together in a way that sort of they move in lockstep. And my sort of kind of own work in this field and drawing on many others that have been working on this for generations led me to think that there was more to say and think through about the relationship between law and the carceral state. And so creating a classroom that has law students and graduate students from different disciplinary perspectives thinking together about this seemed to me to be a really sort of potentially generative space for everyone involved, mostly through exploring the potentialities in law, for law students to see and imagine the law anew, and for people from outside of law to think about the different ways in which law might provide leverage in relationship to the problems that we are facing down. And so just very briefly, and then I will stop, the kinds of things that the course does is first tries to think about together about a kind of common set of readings that we can all do together to kind of get a grounding in the history of the carceral state and the history of abolition. And by that, I really want them to go back to think about antebellum America as a starting point for trying to understand abolition and its various incarnations across time, both in facing down slavery and other forms of oppression. Then kind of also get, and this is where the University Archives, Eric Moore was absolutely essential to getting this course off the ground as well. And Ellen is going to talk more about some of the ways in which the archives have continued to support and be a part of the endeavor that we're trying to pursue through the classroom. But it's to get them into the space of the University Archives, to walk around. Ellen helped them see the bowels of the archives and what they contain, and also to start to learn how to use the archives. So understanding how knowledge is organized within the archives as knowledge projects, and the ways in which the archive itself organizes knowledge and creates and sustains certain sort of forms of evidence and leaves others completely absent. And so thinking about both the sort of ways that we can read along and against the grain, and maybe in other ways as well, as we'll talk about in this sort of roundtable. And also to introduce them to the ethical dilemmas involved in working with archives, especially one of the things I think about a lot in my own work is the way in which we're basically conscripting people into our historical narratives in ways that I think are morally problematic. And so I'm always alive to those kinds of challenges and eager to think them through with others who are working with similar kinds of sources. And then the final piece of this is not only to sort of develop archival projects individually or in groups, but then to think about what they're for. Who are we trying to speak to? Who are we trying to communicate with and lift up and support and work with? One of the sort of unrealized ambitions of this course is to be more integrally involved in work with community partners of varying sorts. I think that's an enormous challenge that I haven't begun to, I think, fully surmount. But we've started to bring in folks from MPD 150 have come into the class. We've invited and learned from Liat Ben Moshe, who came and talked about her book, Decarcerating Disability. And then we've had folks like Michelle Phelps, who is working on a sort of really incredibly important study of the Minneapolis Police Department and its relationship with the communities of Minneapolis, especially North Minneapolis. And she came and talked about her ongoing research. And these all are sort of, I think, really potent possibilities in terms of working with others within this university and beyond it to try to bring this kind of research in the archives and make it accessible. I think one of the things we're learning is the challenges of access and ways that we can help enable access through the research and writing and other projects that we're pursuing here. And so I think that's all I want to say at this point, but I just wanted to kind of set the table for you all to talk a little bit about your various ways of engaging with the material of the course.
So now I'll invite the students to talk a little bit about their project. That's okay. Dewitt, do you want to?
Yeah, so I can start. So I wasn't a student in that class. I was actually a summer RA that morphed into a TA in the summer of fall 21. And so for me, I was interested in even working with this project, not because my research is directly related to carcerality in the state. It was more because of the method of the archive. I had previously been introduced to the archival research in the fall of 2017 in a class in a mediography and history class, and that class kind of shook me a little bit because I was kind of tasked with going in the archive and finding something to work on and write a paper. And for me, I learned quickly that the archive, my relationship with the archive was going to be different than the other students. I was the only Black student in the class, and the professor, I wasn't prepared to understand the relationship that Black people have to the archive. And so through that class, I kind of, through frustration and kind of trying to figure out and not having the readings, I kind of fought my way through to figure out that it was possible to do work, but it took me through a lot. And so when I saw the opportunity to work in this class, I really wanted to be a part of it because I really think that the archival method is a really powerful way for us to think about knowledge, history, and but also the present.
Yeah, for sure. So when I think about my takeaways from the class, I think about really three distinct categories. First is sort of breaking down what abolition is. I think our understanding of the carceral state and abolition can get easily obscured when we're actively living in political spaces. And so even simple things like understanding different organizations, their platforms, and what abolitionist discourses look like in very concrete ways that are sort of depoliticized in a sense that it's abstracted away from like voting and election cycles, or more so in like what are the foundations of the ways in which you can strategize around actually either ending carceral institutions or engaging in acts of restorative justice for people that are disproportionately impacted by incarceration. And so I think sort of dealing with the very nature of that and being able to have a more contingent understanding of these methodologies allowed me to engage in not only more expansive ideas, but it gives, I think, a key part of that is that it gives people sort of a grammar, right? I think a lot of times the issue is when you're confronted with, I guess, oppositionary ideas or zones of conflict, right? Is that we don't have a grammar or language to be able to articulate exactly what it is we're trying to say, and being able to put all that into sort of a concrete structure was extremely helpful. The second part is methods. I think Dewitt already spoke a little bit on this, so I won't say too much, but as someone who is, I guess, younger in an academic sense in terms of dealing with methodological approaches to these different areas of academic work and inquiry, being able to have a method I can hang my hat on and say, well, I know how to engage in archival work, right? Because it wasn't, hey, do an independent project, go do some primary research and sort of throws you out into this world. Rather, it's
we have a request to speak slower for the sake of the captioners.
yeah, no problem.
Okay, thanks.
Rather, it's what was I saying? Oh yeah, it doesn't throw you out into the world like, hey, just do archival work in general, but rather we had an introduction into the archive where we were able to engage with that both intellectually. It's like, what is an archivist space? Having the different staff and faculty in those areas help us get an understanding of, okay, what do you keep? What do you exclude? Why do you exclude certain things? What do we have? And then also those visual representations of being able to actually walk through the, whatever it is, 20 football fields worth of boxes and different materials to get an idea of where does all this information that very much characterizes our history and in some ways informs our present, like what does that look like, and what are the sort of holding cells and confines for that, right? And I think the last part is being able to play a little bit with form. I think that this part doesn't get spoken about a lot in terms of the options for being able to summate the class, right? So when I'm thinking about final project work and what that deliverable looks like, it wasn't just we need like a 25-page paper and that was the confines of our graded products, but we were able to engage in spaces like ArcGIS. I was able to include poetry. I included music in my presentation. And so really dealing with, if this really is a method about deconstruction and construction of something different, how do you approach that, not just from an intellectual inquiry, but from an analysis of form, right? Can we only deconstruct and construct through a paper writing or other ways and mediums and zones through which you can engage in those creative relationships? So yeah, I think those are my three key things. Sorry for speaking too fast.
It's a problem. It's a problem we all have. We'll just work on it. But thank you, Akeem. Treasure, do you want to?
Yeah. I'll just pull my mask down. So I'll speak first, I guess, as from my takeaways as a student in the class. So I took the class as a student at the same time as Akeem in the fall of 2021. And to be honest, when I started the class, I was
really interested in histories about abolition, histories of the carceral state. But I wasn't totally sure why I was in a law class, and why I was doing this in the law school. The first reading in a law journal further confused me on that point. I was like, why is this so long? What am I doing here? So I think that one of the biggest takeaways that I have from the class is just the importance of being able to think interdisciplinary across those two categories if you're interested in doing work on abolition and carcerality. So being able to think really critically about what the law is, how we think about the law, and how this kind of interplay of law and society structures both like our ability to think through the archives as well as our ability to think through some of these narratives that we have around the carceral state. And so when I came into the class, I really, I'm a PhD candidate in the history department, and I really wasn't sure what my research was going to focus on yet. I had some vague ideas, but doing the archival work for the class and doing it explicitly from this framework of trying to think about the carceral state and trying to think about it through an abolitionist methodology, which one of the other RAs who's not here today, Chiara Padilla, we had a mid-semester meeting on our research, and Chiara was like, but what is, like, how are you approaching this from an abolitionist methodology? And I had no answer and no response to that question. And I don't think I had really thought through what an abolitionist methodology meant broadly or what it would mean to me in my research, just that I saw myself in the present moment as an abolitionist who was doing historical work. And so I think what that meant for me was thinking broadly about what carcerality can look like and what it can mean and how it structures different institutions. And so I think that was my other, other than a research project, I think that was my other big takeaway, was thinking about like how we can see different aspects of carcerality and how we can understand those as institutionalized frameworks that that we're trying to address, and trying to think through the historical processes by which they came to seem naturalized and to seem like they belong. So I think that's what I can say in terms of my experience as a student from the class.
Thank you. That's actually a great lead in to the next field I kind of wanted to open up for discussion, which is the ways that this class or in your research has made carcerality feel like a useful framework for your own work. So any of you want to weigh in on that? A thought about that?
I'll start. So my work centers labor precarity, and in many ways, I mean, that is baked into carcerality. But I think for me, the kind of lead in or the simple thing that kind of resonates is that when we think about carcerality or we think about labor precarity, when you kind of pull away a lot of the pieces, is, you know, power imbalances in asymmetrical power relationships. And so for me, this class really can show you what happens when power is unevenly viewed and distributed in different ways. It looks like it, you know, it looks differently in different spaces. In some cases, it might look like carcerality being in prison. In other cases, it might be, you know, being exploited at a job. But we also know that prisoners are also in prison and exploited labor-wise. And so this type of class, or at least lets me realize that there's a certain granularity to power, and it kind of, and there's a texture of it, and it kind of is constantly being remade and reanimated and reformulated in many ways. And so it's important that even if that's not your center of your work, like, think about the resonances, you know, and how that really, you know, shows up at different places, but also at different times.
Interesting. Akeem, did you?
Yeah, I can go. I think, sorry, can you say the question one more time?
Oh, the ways that you had come to see carcerality itself as a formation that was useful for you.
All right, cool. Yeah, I was gonna answer that. I was just making sure.
All right, well, good. Glad it was the question.
Yeah. So I guess I'll be brief here. So as someone who the theoretical basis for my work is more aligned with discussions of anti-Blackness and Blackness as a racial ontology, juxtaposed to just like racial identity, a category. And so I've always been sort of thinking and theorizing about carcerality. I think that the class and those discussions of carcerality are important in terms of my applications to my work now, because I think it becomes easy for people to relegate like issues of carcerality and abolition to just the site of the prison or just the site of the jail. And so thinking about that beyond the confines, like what does that mean from a legal practice? But in my case, like the work that I do, what does that mean from a position of healthcare and medical experimentation and bodies that are seen disposable and bodies that are always at a state of incarceration, regardless of whether or not they're physically, within cells or physically within a prison category. And so, yeah, I think just expanding the places that we sort of apply that analytic to other spaces that may be seemingly separate is really where I find the utility in my scholarship and my work.
Yeah, I would agree with what Akeem said in terms of the class really taught me to think about the site of carcerality as not limited to maybe just sites of physical incarceration. I think that the other really big emphasis of the class and focus of the class is the intersections of the university and the carceral state, and trying to really understand universities broadly as sites which perpetuate in many ways the ability of the state to surveil the technologies of the carceral state, but also how this university in particular has played a really strong role in that. And the ways that by thinking critically about the university, we can think more broadly about institutions and systems of power as well. So the university does not, while it is a particular type of institution, there are many types of institutions that fulfill that same role. And so I think by having that focus in this class, it allows you to really start to structure your thinking about the carceral state, thinking critically about universities, but thinking critically about institutions broadly.
I don't know, Susanna and Ellen, does that resonate for you at all? Like, did you, based on your involvement with the university or with this class, how are you feeling about carcerality and carceral studies as frameworks?
I think, well, I didn't take the class, but thinking about, so I can't speak much to that, but thinking about in archives, how we deal within an institution and how do we use what we have to deconstruct it and critically analyze it when it is part and parcel of the institution itself. And so thinking about how do we ask some of these questions, and all three of you brought up things like power or intersectionality and many of these issues which bring the complexity of doing archival research. I think those are the things that I grapple with a lot in terms of histories are very complex and nuanced, and at the same time for us in university archives as an institutional archive, our narratives are fairly narrow because they're mostly an administrative narrative. So also, how can we surface things which really aren't there?
Yeah, the surfacing is really a great way of articulating what I sort of found as I was in the space of the classroom. And I will admit it, tension, right? Because one of the things I think I was attempting to surface was our own complicity as members of this university community. The university is, of course, embedded in the carceral state in all sorts of very obvious ways. We lived through a president pronouncing herself committed to severing the relationship between the, Minneapolis Police Department at a certain moment, which called attention to a lot of things beyond that relationship that can be thought of in terms of, the university's relationship to the carceral state. But as I surfaced those in the classroom, I never stopped being aware of my own positionality. I'm standing up in front of the classroom. There are all sorts of ways in which there are structures that involve grading and involve different forms of evaluation that felt deeply in tension with the enterprise of this class. And so, I struggled with that. I continue to struggle with that as I think about what this course should be and can be to students, as well as kind of those of us who are on the faculty as we learn from the experience of teaching this way. And I continue to experiment with different forms of pedagogy that work to at least unsettle some of the sort of routines of the academy that I think deserve some really serious critical appraisal.
Can I just add?
Yeah.
One thing related to that, I was thinking about even the act of doing research as so fraught with many of these rules, processes, policies, thinking about reading rooms where you need an appointment in advance. Sometimes not with using our collections, but in a lot of repositories, you have to present a form of identification. Surveillance with security cameras in reading rooms. So also thinking about those layers of who is invited in or not to do this kind of research before you even get to the complicated questions about content.
Well, that's an excellent segue, Ellen, into a question that I wanted to pose about the university and our own positionality within the university, and also as we face outside of it as representatives of the university. So I guess there's two questions in that idea. One is, how did this class make you think about the university and its entanglements with the carceral state, meaning universities broadly, but also how did it make you think about your own positionality and this particular university and the difference that it makes to think about these questions within the space of a law school in the context of doing that with other law students. So there's a lot. Just pick the thing you want to talk about.
That last part was about our relationship to other students in these.
Yeah, like the difference that it made that you were doing this thinking in the context of a class that was in the law school.
And that you're a joint degree student.
Right.
In your way, maybe you embody the two different disciplines.
Hmm.
I can speak. on
Yeah,
that. I was thinking actually in response to what Ellen was saying as well, just a moment ago, I think that one of the things that really struck me in 2021 as a student in the class, and even more so as a TA for the class, is and I think it's also in line with some of the comments that Dewitt and Akeem made earlier, is just like how complicated it is for students to go into archives, broadly speaking, how many access barriers there are for students, and that exists for both the logistical questions, like Ellen was talking about. It exists because of the racial power dynamics that Dewitt was talking about. But it also exists in terms of disciplinary questions, right? So as somebody who, in undergrad went into archives with a professor who really showed me like hands-on, like how to do that. Coming into this class, I was in a very good position to know what I wanted to do in the archives and how to do that work. That's not the case for a lot of people coming into these classes. And I feel like in class after class that has asked for people to do archive work, I've seen that. And I think there are a lot of ways that structures how students think that they can do, what types of work students think they can do, and how they see themselves going about that. If you don't see the archives as a space that you can go into and understand and be able to access, I think that it's really difficult to even start down that path, right? I think the other really big thing for this class was that we started off with MPD 150, which I think, if people don't know, was a community produced report, like 150-year history of the Minneapolis Police Department, that was actually produced before 2020, but then was re-released in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. And that was an example of a community community group going in and doing archival work for an explicitly abolitionist project that showed sort of the power in the ways that you can use the archive, but I think also pointed to me the ways that if this was done in a collaborative manner and consistently done in a collaborative manner, how much more powerful something like that could be and how many more narratives could be included in it. And so I think there's also questions of how do we preserve student research? Like, how do we preserve the work that students have already done from the academy so that work can be accessible to future researchers that want to go in and see it? How do we make it so that somebody knows what archives to look for when they want to look into the history of policing, or they want to look into the history of surveillance in their neighborhood, but they don't know like the right keywords to look for, or the right archives to search in, or even what an archive means, right? How do we make that more accessible? I think those are like the big questions in terms of pedagogy and methodology that come up for me from this course, and thinking about what universities can even be doing in that regard.
I can go. I feel like I had to pause, but I have like so many thoughts on this. I feel like this could easily be a forever conversation and take up the rest of the time, honestly, because
Go ahead.
but because like I don't know, like the university is, well, I guess first and foremost, like the research project that I ended up doing in that particular class was very much focused on the development of like university policing, because especially when you're talking about huge like tier 1, tier 2, these universities who are very intimately tied to the states in which they're situated. Like everything here is University of Minnesota, right? All of these local officials, state officials, like most of these people are graduating from the U are related to the University of Minnesota in one form or another. And so it's not even as though you can separate those two entities, like here's the school and then here's the rest of life. And I think in a lot of places, especially when you think about like parents sending their children off into school education to learn, like these spaces are supposed to be in the public imagination, safe spaces, like spaces that are reserved for learning and intellectual inquiry, and being able to like, position yourself in a strategic way for some other form of profession or for some other professionalization. And I think when you think about these sort of intricate ties between university and mechanisms of policing, it starts to really upset that narrative in these really interesting ways. And because like, yeah, the university is a place to learn, but also this university is a place of a lot of violence is happening concurrently. And it's not even just historical violence. Like we even got the report today about like sexual assault issues that are happening at the university, right? And like we get emails or text messages or whatever all the time about issues with campus policing and violence that may or may not be occurring at all these different sites, both on or near campus. And then, Professor Blumenthal is always talking about like these disciplining approaches and like what does it mean to be disciplined in these very interesting ways, whether it's from like professor to student discipline or from like in faculty in general or staff discipline, or like there's so many levels and tiers of the university that are always intertwined and always impacting you, I think, in these very strange and intense ways. And then, even being in that class, taking the class and learning, you're simultaneously sitting next to people who want to participate in the carceral system in some form or another, right? Like I could be here and then right next to me, somebody who is working really hard to be a prosecutor, right? And it's like, what is your relationship to prosecution? Can we even commingle in this space? Like, are we operating on two completely different wavelengths? And what is sort of cooperative work or work in that sort of framework of class look like? But we may or may not have like two very opposing ideals about how you participate in engagement systems. And then, which is a larger question about what does engagement with these systems look like? Is it about absconding from these situations, or is it about a different type of investment into them, which I think are two different abolitionist frames. And so I do think that, there's all these little moments of relationships between university, both in a historical sense, but also in like a contemporary sense, and also in a way that it's constantly being proliferated. Like it isn't just a thing of the past, it's something that you have to actively exist and live within, which is visible to some and not visible to others. and again, like these processes of disciplining. And so, yeah, I do think it's tied to, my academic work. It's tied to my relationships. It's tied to my movement. There's certain ways that we have to move and navigate this space to account for the ways in which you may or may not be disciplined. And there are certain people who aren't here right now because they've just been disciplined. There's certain people who maybe should have been disciplined who are still in this space, right? And so I think that's all a part of it too. And it's and I don't know, I guess in dealing with it, it's something that like I'm always, and I think a lot of people are always kind of reflecting upon. And I mean, that can cause, really, like, that can cause physical responses if you just know you're always operating within a place of violence, depending on how that violence manifests, because it's not just that these ideas exist in the abstract, but if in your routine space, or this, for us, this 9 to 5 space is a place of violence in a lot of ways. It can cause anxiety, it can cause depression. Like, I think there are very real implications for the ways in which we engage this, not just the work that we study, but how we're always constantly being impacted by these overlapping forms of violence. And I think lastly is like Professor Ho's in the room, right? So it's like understanding it very structurally versus understanding some of the more minutia of how this violence is operated. I think part of it is that in my considerations and thinking about the university, it becomes easy to sort of think about it very abstractly because it's such an overwhelming enterprise. Like, none of us are really talking to like the chancellor and these people who are making decisions at these very huge, grandiose levels. And so being able to really chart out like where this violence is operating, how it's operating, when does it start, when does it end, and then how do we resolve that, I think is a lot of what goes into that.
Okay. So for me, this question made the geography for me jump out a bit because I began thinking a lot about the land grant institution.
Yeah.
I've been educated, all the schools I've been at have been land grants. And so when I think about the relationship between the carceral state and the university, it goes back to that land grant, and these institutions are together. We usually see the university, the prison, the library, help, as separate, but they are, deeply embedded, within each other. And and thinking about my experience, this helped me really see the connection. And in particular, I want to pivot a little bit away from the university archive. We also went to the Historical Society, and that space, what I took away from that, spending those wonderful Saturdays there, were like, with all the rules of when you can come, when you can't, was how many people were there. In very different than the university archive, where we select, it was more people from the general population, more people outside of university, and just seeing how they were there. And I couldn't help but overhear the conversation. A lot of them were looking up records for births and parents, the family genealogy, and just seeing how much of an interest. But when you think about, but then it was easy to kind of see who was there and who wasn't. They were quite older. The majority, 99%, were white, and it was really interesting seeing their relationship to the state, which is very different than other, the people of color and people who marginalized in different ways. And so, I'm always struck at how these institutions are framed, but it's really through how our positionalities are framed. And so it has, and it's really relational. And so for certain people, the institutions are benign, neutral, for others, they're harmful. And so, that goes into how people might interact with them. And so, for me, I think that you really can, really can learn a lot, in thinking through people's relationship to institutions and kind of what that looks like for them, even within the same institution, where for some it might be a great space and others not so great. And finally, I'll end with the not being a law student, not ever having really been in a law class. My experience in doing it's really taught me a lot about legal education in the U.S. Unfortunately, the majority of my legal education, and probably many others, we learn from popular culture, especially stuff like Legally Blonde. Like, that is really high in people's minds of what law is, and so that colors how people think about law. And and learning how law students approach the law, and learning on what's the assumed knowledge, it really kind of shook me up a bit, because it actually goes quite, in conflict with the more critical social science stuff that I'm more, used to. And so that, made, left people wondering, same institution, but yet very different knowledge projection.
So there's a lot here that I want to talk about, but I guess I'm really moved to push the part of this conversation that's about the archive itself, both as an object of study, but also as a place that can be a resource for racial and justice movements more broadly, if you think that's possible. And I guess this connects both to the policies of archives themselves, but also the ways we use them. So to use your phrase, Dewitt, what are the possibilities for reading along the archival grain, against the archival grain? Dewitt, you had this lovely phrase of doing it around the archive. What does that look like in your experience? What do you take from your research for this class? Ellen, what do you see happening in the archives? I'm just interested in the possibilities of the archive, I guess.
You should probably start.
Well,
Yeah, since you got here.
Okay. Okay, I'll just say I'm trained, I would say methodologically, I'm most comfortable being an ethnographer. So for me, the archive was something I learned a lot later in my intellectual, maturation. And so I think it's super useful, but what comes with me, it comes with the ethnographer's way of thinking about knowledge and power. So for me, when I started my first, archival project, I had to lean heavily on Black feminist thought to kind of get me through. It was really hard for me to do a project. I basically was doing a project in the archives in Wisconsin Historical Society, the MNT papers, and I was trying to find something that related to sports, particularly, hopefully, a Black athlete. It took me a while to figure out what to do. But I was able to use the work of like Marissa Jason Wintez, Hartman, Sadia Hartman to kind of help me figure out that I might not be able to find a full document or a full piece of paper, but pieces and parts can constitute a larger whole. And so for me, I think it's really possible through triangulation, through what Hartman's calling critical fabulation, to make these stories when they're not full, where they're pieces and parts and not, full documents or full, or I guess not as legible as other things might appear to be.
Okay, I have a lot to say that I could say. I think I've already answered part of this question in terms of the ways that I think that there's a lot lacking in terms of the access to the archives, but I kind of want to answer this question in terms of how we prepared for the second course, the second time the course was taught. So over the summer of 2022, I worked with Susanna to build, Dewitt and Chiara and Susanna had spent the first summer really going into the archives and doing all of this amazing preliminary research into just what is accessible, what was out there that people could find, right? And going through and finding all this amazing archival work that to be honest, I feel like wasn't super taken up in the class. And I think that's one part that we could talk about a bit is how to actually get students to take up the work of engaging with the university, histories of the university, histories of the carceral state, which is surprisingly difficult. But so they had done all this amazing research, and I think we kind of talked about these issues where we saw that students maybe were intimidated by going into the archives, and a lot of this material maybe was like overwhelming in a certain sense, right? And so we spent some time putting together a set of research guides on topics that we hoped would be of interest to the students in the class. And we basically took all of this archival work but tried to put it into almost a narrative form that kind of gave students into these projects and gave them ways to start thinking about, well, I'm really interested in histories of disability, or I'm really interested in disability legislation now. let me think about how I could approach that from an archival perspective and think about, where the intersections of the carceral state and disability exist. And so we put together these 4 broad research kind of guides that mostly worked with local archives, mostly looked, MNHS, the university archives, Hennepin County Library archives. And we did that with Ellen and with Eric Moore, and also with Linnea Anderson from the Social Welfare History Archives. We're all collaborators on that project. But I think that that's like one way of thinking about how to make the archive like as an object of study more accessible, and also thinking about those documents as things that could be shared more publicly and broadly out, not just from within a classroom setting, but as that type of like targeted research being available to community members who might want to do that type of research or look into that type of work. And so, a lot of archives already do research guides, but including the Anderson archives and especially MNHS, but those aren't necessarily targeted in this kind of to borrow a phrase like rebel archive type of framework. They're not really looking at it in a more subversive sense all the time. And so I think for that to be like one of the big products of this class, and it's something that could live on and grow and like develop more themes and more pieces of it as well.
Ellen, I'm so eager to hear your thoughts on this.
I have so many thoughts. First, I'm totally going to steal Rebel Archive. So I think about kind of the question, can institutions change? Can archives be sites of change? Can archives be sites for racial and social justice? I hope they can. I want them to be. I think so. So I don't go wandering off. I'll talk about this in sort of 3 areas. So thinking about what do we actually have in the archives? And it's not just about what collections we get in or who donates collections, but it's also how do we help people think about like their own experiences are important to archive. And thinking about how many people, how many communities traditionally have been told that their experiences aren't important or valuable. And so when we're already operating from this sort of deficit model in terms of who is in the archive and how people think about archives, there are so many negative stereotypes, I think, that it does present a challenge, especially for students. I don't know how many times I've not here in a previous job, seeing a class of students come into the archives and I'll just sort of like, why do we have to go to the library again? Or the archives are just going to be old and boring. But I think really how can we help change narratives around how important it is for people to think about their own experiences, even if it never comes to our archives, any archives, but helping that change that there's something about intrinsic experiences that matter. And I think archives as a profession, as organizations, maybe haven't done the best job in helping people to see that, at least people who traditionally haven't been part of that. I think about description and access. So thinking about students coming, thinking about collections that have been digitized. But I think a lot about, who's creating the descriptions of those when the archival profession is, 86, I can't remember the most recent number, but majority white. And so, what are the identities of the people writing the descriptions of materials, which is how students, researchers find those. There's a lot of sort of cultural context, community context that is just missing. And so that's a disservice that I think as a profession, we need to find ways to kind of work on that. And the last thing, and I sort of talked about this a little bit, sort of reading room policies, but I think even when we try and make things more accessible, you know, I feel like I hear time and time again, we want the reading room to be a more welcoming place. We want more people to feel welcomed in the archives. And I think, like, what does that actually mean? Like, what does that really look like? And do we have kind of the power, the resources, the impetus to make what could be seen as really drastic changes, I think, to people who have been doing kind of traditional archives for much longer. So, okay, I'll stop there.
Yeah, go right ahead.
Yeah, I would say, and also in line with what Dewitt was talking about in terms of like critical fabulation and stuff like that. One thing is like reading the archive, I guess, is an art, but it's also like always an art of failure. And so there's all like, you can't approach it with sort of this all knowing, all seeing eye. Like, you're always going to be able to uncover these truths or able to uncover sort of the context around these truths. I think that's probably a key part, especially when we're thinking about like you were talking about genealogical sort of inquiries from, you know, white counterparts. But you know, what does it mean to like trace back carceral history? And what does it mean to trace back like Black history, anti-Black history in spaces where genealogy and genealogical interventions are sort of like pushed to the wayside with, you know, interruptions of like chattel enslavement and things like that. And so yeah, it's always an art of failure, and you're always gonna have to sort of construct history and sort of work around these spaces. And also, like when you're thinking about prison and carcerality, it's like, you know, and I read some of these historian books, and it's difficult for people to, I guess, like uncover, right, these histories about prison, because a lot of this, there's different types of archives, right? Like you're working with university archives, and then there's some form of state archives, there's private archives, police officers, like there's other state apparatus that have their own separate archives, in which it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to access resources about particular events that may paint a narrative that people don't want to have to deal with on the latter end, right? And so there are all these stories that have been heard, all these stories that are not going to be heard. And then I always like probe, like, you know, where do we find the utility in hearing very particular stories? And what are the applications of that? Is that for our own gratification about the ways in which we engage in or conceptualize people identity based demographics or violence in like this holistic way? Is that the necessity of pulling this particular thing that wasn't accessible prior? Or is it, you know, is there some sort of useful application of that very nuanced knowledge you would get from a site that you don't have access to? Like sometimes I'll look at things in the archive and they'll say, you know, well, this is redacted or this you can't access. And I'm like, well, okay, like, I don't know. Like, I didn't need to know that set of personal information. I didn't think that was going to change the trajectory of how I'm engaging with this notion of violence. But from a historian perspective, they might want every single detail that they can get because they think it's necessary to voice the unheard, you know? So I think there are all these, you know, different relationships.
Akeem, I have to say your answer makes me want to ask a related question to anyone, but I'm thinking especially of you and Dewitt. Are there, that would kind of connect the two parts of this conversation, are there things, sort of structural things that archives can do to make possible the kinds of methodologies that are needed for this work? Are there things archives can do to allow for reading against the grain, reading along the grain, thinking of the archives as a space? Have you been in places where that worked? Have you seen places where that worked, Ellen? Or is it about simply about classes like this and training folks and giving them tools and authorization to do that?
Well, I can just go real quick. I think part of what I'm saying is that it's impossible.
Okay.
So it doesn't matter how Professor Blumenthal taught that class. It didn't matter what Ellen's doing in the archives. There's just certain things that we're not going to get from that space.
Right.
And you have to be okay going into that space knowing that. Like, we can't go in there with expectations about things that can be rectified that the archives cannot rectify. And I'm speaking also, again, particularly as it relates to carcerality and Black experience and Black experience with carcerality, right? And so I think once you embrace that, then you're opening yourself up to have new ideologies and new ways of being able to engage in scholarship and the work that is available to you that wouldn't have been otherwise. Otherwise, you're just going to be on sort of this endless path looking for context that you're just not going to get, and it's not going to occur. And so I think there are other spaces of archive. Like I've been to hip hop archives at Harvard and I think the Schomburg, like other spaces where that was pretty cool. Like, and I feel like I got sort of a well-rounded story that isn't necessarily dealing with this particular form of violence in the way that I'm trying to engage with. Yeah.
For me, I think it really depends on your, intent. I think that for me, what I've found when I was doing my first archive project, I actually went to somebody who would end up becoming a Black archivist at HBCU, and he was super helpful to me. And he kind of, first I was like, am I, why don't this make sense to me? He was like, nah, I'm like, is it just me? Am I not getting? He's like, no, this is what happened. And so he kind of laid down the, map for me to understand that what I've experienced is what people experienced prior. And so for me, while I do agree with Akeem that certain things are not going to always be accessible, I do think that this type of class, but plus a continued active engagement with diversifying the field will make it a lot more than what it is. I think that while there are going to be certain things, I think that each method has its strengths and weaknesses in that, and so that no method is going to be can do all. Like ethnography can't do it all. Archival digital methodologies, and Lord knows I know that stats. Sorry, quantitative people, but stats cannot do it all. So each method has its strengths and weaknesses, and so I think that while it won't ever do it all, I think that it can be improved through a better engagement with, with a wider range of ideas, methodologies, intersections, research, epistemologies, and ontologies. So, hopefully, if the archival and archival work is, engages more with Black studies, Latin American, Latinx studies, Asian American studies, Indigenous studies, it will be better than what it is.
Also, just from a practical sense, like archives are also underfunded spaces too. And so sometimes you're trying to go, boxes aren't even, nobody sorted the box, nobody's labeled the box. So just to say from like an efficiency perspective, I mean, they need support, we need support, can't read anything, can't find anything. So digitalizing archives too, accessibility questions, but yeah.
I think that also speaks to there's, I think, some very practical, I think also this also comes down to how archives are organized, right? And so I think that there are times when, yes, there's always going to be, you're never going to be able to find them. I totally agree with what you said, Akeem, about archives being a practice and failure and a very humbling experience. But I also think that archives, the way that they're organized is set up to privilege certain narratives. I think we all know that. One thing that I think about is just how collaboration between researchers and archivists could result in reorganizing archives where you could find that material, right? Like when I'm going through a set of meeting minutes that, seem to be completely irrelevant to somebody studying Black life in Minneapolis, and I find mention of NAACP meetings that are being held at this institution, there's no way for me to indicate that was happening. There's and I'm not finding that in the newspapers. I'm not seeing that being listed anywhere else. And so I think that there's also maybe ways to collaborate with some of these issues of funding as well, where you could say researchers are in these archives going through them and spending, so many hours of our lives going through these documents and just looking for one little trace of something. But how many other things are they finding that could really help a researcher who's trying to look for marginalized communities, who's trying to look for people whose voices have been taken out of that archive intentionally, and yet there are these traces in there that somebody might never think to go into that particular box to look for. And so I think that's where, what if we could have something like a crowdsourced finding aid where people could upload their own images that they took? What archivist, what researcher doesn't go in and take pictures of every single page that they're looking at, right? And those pages just end up on their laptop. They don't get shared with other people. Their notes don't get shared. How could we create something constructively that could help us to lower the amount of failure that we're experiencing every single time that we're going in to look for something, and help us find more and more of those pieces? Because as much as like the archival experience for a modernist is just too much paperwork, like that makes it so that so much more gets hidden underneath all of that each time. Yeah.
I think that's an awesome idea. I think there are so many layers to this, and part of it stems from when you have these very traditional fields and disciplines and ways that things have always been done. Thinking, how do we undo that? And so thinking about like Professor Jalile Suriel in history and I are collaborating very closely, and both of us are, have talked about how we haven't ever done work like this before in terms of both, a historian and an archivist collaborating in this way. And I think there's a really great article about radical empathy in the archives, and sort of this feminist idea practice that archives are all about relationships. And I think there's a lot of the field that is still, fortunately, it's changed a lot over the last however many decades, but archives are not just these neutral sources and spaces of information, but spaces of power and privilege. And one of the ways that we really need to change how we think about the work we do and what we do with collections is through relationships of archivists with creators of the materials, of researchers who come in and use things. And so I think being more open to thinking about the archives in a lot more creative ways is really important.
The one thing I would add is that in terms of thinking of the archives as sites of possibility, especially for racial and social justice, as Dewitt was, I think, alluding to, there are lots of archives that are, and actually also Akeem, that aren't accessible at all because the state controls them. One of the things lawyers can do is file FOIA requests or other kinds of sort of ways of pressuring the state to give up information and create access to archives that they keep. And so I think one of the things that I'm exploring with some of the colleagues I have in the law school and in other organizations locally is different ways to bring the Rebel Archive is a certain way of thinking about the ways in which you sort of call the state to account through accessing information that they are keeping under cover. And so one of the challenges I think that we want to meet going forward with this course is to think about ways that we can mobilize the legal knowledge that exists within the classroom itself in terms of law students to think about ways that they can be using the space of the classroom as a springboard for kind of bringing these kinds of legal actions against the state for keeping material from us.
Yeah. So I want to leave a little time for other things, but as a way of wrapping up at least this part of the conversation, I wonder if we can articulate some of the ideas that we've generated in the conversation and that you've thought of on your own about how to build this pilot project outward. So this class and Susanna's enterprise and the collaboration with the archives was all kind of an experiment. And I'm interested in terms of teaching carcerality, in terms of introducing students to archival methods, in terms of using the archive and recognizing its limitations. What do we build outward and how do we do that? What do you, and I think it's okay to be a utopian for once. What could happen? What would you like to see happen with this kind of collaboration and enterprise?
I'll go because I something really short to say.
Yeah.
I just feel like more partnerships between people who are outside of that space and inside of that space. So like, for example, even from a class or negotiation discussion, having people who are both formally incarcerated, but people who are also actually incarcerated at the moment of the conversation are just essential. Like anyone will say that if you're doing work in carcerality, you can't do that and not be talking to people who either are currently impacted by that or were formerly impacted like that. and you can't use one to replace the other. So you can't have formally impacted people trying to tell you what it's like being incarcerated when they're not incarcerated at that moment. Those are two different narratives. And so I think, yeah, that is essential to being able to engage in any conversation about what does it mean to push forward in the area of carcerality or abolitionist politics.
Similarly, I think thinking about the ways that long-term relationships could be built with organizations that are doing work in this field, that students can contribute to their projects in some kind of way. So bringing in your own particular disciplinary knowledge, learning how to speak across those disciplines, but also deploying that in the work of anti-carceral activism, anti-carceral organizing and mobilization. I think there's, and I think there's a lot of complications to that. And I think there's reasons to take it very slowly and to build that as like a very long-term relationship that students are contributing to rather than extracting from. And I think that should be stated explicitly, but I think that is a possibility. And I think that the students that are taking these classes have a lot of resources and skills at their disposal that they could offer to different projects and think about ways of, going back to the archives, ways of bringing that archival work to bear in a really productive way and in a really immediate in this moment rather than necessarily historically facing type of project.
I think that this type of kind of building and building this forward, I think it'd be a lot about grounded in local knowledge, local history, and then using that to kind of flesh it out and then connect that to larger national issues. I think that would be really helpful for students to kind of ground it in the very particular local at this university, whatever university they're at, and then connect that to larger national. And then even if you have, space we can, even think about, international, issues of imprisonment. And so I think that would be super helpful and, productive in thinking about how these local knowledges, these local histories, these local types of incarceration actually, work a little differently in different spaces, but are connected, and then and that could show how they actually are connected, large scale across the, I guess the world.
And I know you said you wanted a couple of minutes at the end to talk about the archives. Do you want to say
I think
anything?
I pretty much said the things. I'll just add too, thinking about moving forward, thinking about ways to not only introduce more people to the archives, thinking about how the questions that you all as researchers, we don't know everything that we have in our archives. And so we don't know until we get questions sometimes to explore things. But thinking too about how, like Akeem, I love the idea of, you said you included poetry in your final project. So also thinking about the more people we have engaging and asking different questions, also thinking about the different forms that can take too. And that takes people asking us, because there is no complete set of information. And so to be more creative, I think Dewitt mentioned the parts and pieces. So how can those be brought into something that sometimes might necessitate a more creative response or form too?
I think we have 5 or 10 minutes for questions. If anyone on Zoom has them or in the room. Or if there's a question you all want to take up that we didn't get to.
Hi, I'm Brianna. I'm a third-year student in the PhD Carcerality program. I'm here as part of the community performance ethnography class. But I'm also just really interested in what you're doing. My question had to do with, I know one of you is a dual degree student. Yeah, I was wondering, since most of you are PhD students, if you can give any insight into how this class maybe shifted the thinking of the law students at all, in terms of how they approach archives, or even you know, the grander, like, historical systemic relations of power or anything speaking to that?
I'll start. Yeah, I was kind of surprised. I mean, I had a lot of things, you know, I had assumed that like social sciences, there were more, you know, people that took a more traditional approach, more positivistic, but I also assumed that there also would be more people who were more maybe deconstructionists. But I didn't realize that, no, actually, it's really strongly a positivistic approach to law. And so that kind of surprised me, but also explained about how we see our legal system actually works. But I think Akeem would be great, you know, since he's actually in the law school. I was curious, I always been curious, like, how do you, you know, negotiate those two sides of, you know, learning this on one hand and then learning a different way on the other?
I thought it was more of an objective question, like on the outside looking in, what do you see? So I was like, I'm on the inside and the inside, so I don't know. But I think that, to be quite honest, I don't think that law students really care about this stuff, generally speaking. I think that the ways in which they do care about it are from the point of edification, not from the point of practice. And so it's like, I'm taking this history class to study history because I like history. Or like, I was a history major, and so this is cool. Or I don't know, I just feel like my other classes didn't give me this. Rather than like, how can I incorporate this into the work that I'm doing right now? How can I incorporate this into the things that I'm pushing forward? How can I include this in the legal research I'm doing in this space? And so for me, it's always like they think about these topics and discussions in these classes as like a point of the past. Or they think about it as a point that is irrelevant to their own social location. So they're just like, yeah, this stuff is happening and it's bad, but while it's here, I'm gonna go ahead and do this, you know, and it's not really, and I can't really commensurate those realities. So that's how I see like law students in general. From my own position, I see like the intersections of this work, and honestly, I worked before coming to graduate school, and I tell people all the time, I'm like, I don't even know how I was operating in that workspace without knowing some of the things I've learned coming here. Like the things I learned also, I was like, I don't know how I was functioning in that space. Like I'm going to shareholders meetings and listening to, I'm like looking backwards, I'm like, man, I was ignorant. Like I had no idea what was going on. I thought it was cool. I was like, oh, it was like, oh, you got to get some FaceTime, you know, let people know you're talking. I'm like, none of that, like, it's, you know, and it's just like, I don't know, it's so important to be able to understand the intersection of these spaces. And I have conversations with people all the time, and it's like the way that we view education, and the university is part of this issue, right? Not university in particular, like University of Minnesota has a unique problem, but like the university itself, it really does try to separate us. It's just like we got the med school and then the business school and then the law school, and CLA is just over there on the other side of campus doing its own thing. It's like, I don't know why it's like that, but these things are so intimately intertwined that it's like we have to be able to analyze these relationships concurrently. But the way that it's structured, we make it seem as though these things are operating in separate worlds, and one's considered professional and one's just like regular, and this is worth the certification and so forth and so on. And so I think the value of like me engaging in this work, or like anybody who's engaging in it cross-disciplinary, is that they're able to kind of think through new avenues of analyzing these things inter-embeddedly, instead of thinking about the ways in which these things are separate.
I think that one of the goals of the class is to deconstruct some of these kind of narratives around the carceral state that embedded as really naturalized, and that say, this is how it's always been and how it always will be, right? Like this is, you know, this is the new Jim Crow, right? This is the new this or the new that, where it's always the same story repeating itself time and time again. And I think that one of the nuances that the law students bring into that framework is into the class is to really say, this is how this is operating like on the ground right now. This is how I can see the ways that this these historical processes have like led to a situation where like this is how the courts work and this is how people, you know, try to get appeal or try to go on parole, and the details of that system they bring to the class. I think that one of the hardest things of being involved in it for both law students and graduate students is breaking out of those kind of circular narratives around history and saying, like, let's really look at the historical context and the details of this and think about exactly what is going on here and why this is not the same as that point in the past. And I think that that is takes a while to get into that framework. I don't think that it is necessarily a feature of being a law student or not, but I do think that those narratives can be really powerful in legal argument, right? And so like there is like kind of a mobility to them as well, a way that they can be mobilized. And so I can see they can be mobilized for activist arguments as well, and they frequently are. And I think like kind of trying to emphasize the ways that those narratives don't necessarily serve us when we're trying to advocate for change, the way that they really embed the carceral state as a feature of our life that always has been here and always will be, and is unchanging, or, you know, like I think there's a lot to think of there. And so I think that one of the things that I noticed as a TA in the course was just how powerful those narratives are and how difficult it is to break out of that thinking for all of us. But, you know, it just seems like it just keeps coming back and coming back. And yeah, maybe I'm making one of those narratives now too.
Yeah, I would just quickly add that what's interesting to me from where I've been sitting as these kind of enterprises, the enterprise has sort of unfolded over 2 years of teaching and thinking to 3.0, is that the kind of composition of the class has changed. The first year, I do think, you know, that when Akeem and Tracey were taking it, there were law students that were genuinely, they had not, you know, they were just kind of interested in this, right? They weren't invested in it, and they didn't identify as abolitionists. The second group of students, 90% of them were abolitionists, I would say, just or, you know, sort of in that sort of kind of leaning in that direction. And that changed the dynamics of the class in a lot of ways. It was also very predominantly, for a variety of complicated reasons, mostly law school students. And I think that is going to be, since it sits in the law school, what the composition is going to look like. So one of the real challenges is trying to kind of deal with the kind of really imbalance in the sort of number of students that are in the class that are taking law school courses most of the time, and those who are coming from other disciplinary standpoints. That creates a really complicated set of questions for me as a teacher. But what I think is really interesting to watch is the ways in which they hopefully, to varying degrees, kind of work with these narratives. I mean, Treasure and I spent a lot of time thinking about, like, each week was going to be a new blank, right? And we were going to sort of start with the sort of proposition that there is a way in which, this is the new Jim Crow or the new prison, or all sorts of narratives that had kind of become very culturally available and prominent, and sort of show the ways in which both law and history can be used to disrupt and dismantle, and have both of those kinds of disciplines being sort of introduced to them as sort of kind of ways of thinking that will kind of disrupt these kinds of narratives that are in the academy and are also being mobilized in various other spaces, and make them into tools that they can take with them into sort of the archives to do really granular work, to sort of kind of think about and test the proposition. How much is this like is the prison really operating like a plantation? Let's look and see what's going on inside and really study this carefully. And so that's, I think, then one way that I hope to get law students to sort of continue to work actively with people from other disciplines, to think about how they think about evidence and how they think about and try to test evidence against reigning interpretations and arguments, because that's what law students are really good at doing. And I'm trying to get them to sort of repurpose those kinds of tools in new spaces with different disciplines.
Great. We have, I know there's a question in the Q&A and we have 30 seconds left. So Karen, can I ask you to hold that and we can talk about it afterwards? So maybe I'm going to ask this question very quickly and then ask for brief responses. Kiara asked, my question is about getting students to engage the pulled archives. How did you all go about that aside from the narrative like guides? I agree that it was challenging to get folks to be interested in archival documents that first law and abolition class in 2020.
And I just want to shout out to Kira because she was absolutely with Dewitt, the two of them were heroic in their archival work. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like the main way that we tried to emphasize that was by kind of making the students, break into different groups, focus on the themes of each of the research guides, and kind of really re-emphasizing week after week the importance of doing archival research, going through the different archives that we had pulled with them in class and talking about them, as well as doing kind of primary source analysis in the classroom setting and kind of showing how that's done. Yeah, I don't know if Susanna has anything to add to that.
Yeah, well, I mean, we wanted them to do some of the archival work themselves, so we gave them sort of starting points, and so that we kind of had some ability to know where to point them, so that they weren't spending all of their time doing the searching, right? Like that was the sort of idea behind the first summer with Kieran and Dewitt, is that we just spent all these Saturdays at the archive trying to kind of locate the materials so that they didn't spend their time spinning their wheels. But one of the challenges is that I think about in teaching this course is I want them to have some kind of determination for themselves of what they want to study. But sometimes it feels like that there might be some wisdom here at this point to working with what we've already assembled and having them sort of work from the kind of designated boxes that we've given them, because there's still so much, as Akeem was saying, like a lot of these haven't really been gone through in the way that would sort of generate an easy access and ability. So some of the discovery is still to be had in just like mining a box that we sort of designated as rich with material. And I think what we need to think about going forward here is ways to make more of an exercise out of this. I mean, we started to do some of it with Leanna and Eric when we sort of brought them to the university archive. And I think maybe more encounters like that, where they just sit with a box and try to make sense of it, I think will kind of help that process along so that they can then sort of work from that kind of experience towards their own research goals.
Thank you all so much. Thank you for filling this with your brilliant observations, and thank you for your work in the world, which carries this class and Minnesota Transform forward. And thank you all for coming.